Hi guys, and welcome to our second lecture for our class. Let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking briefly, just a short little lecture to introduce you to a little bit about neuroscience, because as we know, as we've talked about um, in the previous unit, we were talking about the different perspectives in psychology. So there's a lot of different perspectives, right? We said there was the cognitive perspective, the behavioral perspective, psychodynamic perspective, all these different ways that psychologists look at behavior and thought and kind of try to explain it and research it is all based on these kind of their presumptions and also their kind of orientation, this theoretical orientation that they use as they approach these different topics. So the next topic we're going to talk about is maybe looking a little more closely at the neuroscience perspective. And so that's why we're going to talk about in modules 3 and 4, the biology of behavior. So understanding the brain. So today we've got a few videos to look at, and we've also got just a little bit of explanation, and we'll talk about it, and you'll be done. Just want you to have kind of sometimes people learn in a lot of different ways, and so for those of you who learn really well when we're talking about it in lecture, I think that the lecture is going to really benefit you. If you learn only from reading, use the lecture to kind of add to your reading, but I'm trying to give you a lot of interactive assignments as well as the lecture as well as the reading, so that between all of those, hopefully you'll be able to learn and retain this information that we're learning about under our topic of psychology. So today, the top 3 topics that we'll talk about in our lecture is, first, we're going to look at the brain and try to understand which parts of the brain do what. What do each part of the brain have a role in our functioning? Then we're going to talk about the neural and hormonal systems, so different parts, different systems in our body and how those interact and how those impact us. And then we're going to look at the parts of the brain and how they interact with one another to help create really complex thoughts and behaviors. So just how they might, once we learn a little bit about the brain, we're going to understand kind of how they interact, those parts of the brain interact, and then have this, complex thing that is human behavior or behavior and thought processes. So you will have an assignment. You have an assignment in Canvas, and it has about your brain and your brain while driving a car. So as you listen to the lecture today and as you do your reading, make sure you're thinking about how is that part of the brain potentially active while a car is driving. And if you can pay attention to that, you'll be one step ahead when you do your assignment. So here we are in Module 3. I've got this kind of funny little cartoon that I like. We've got the neural and hormonal systems, but what you need to know is that the body is made up of millions and millions of crumbs. It's just a piece of toast there. I thought that was funny because it's kind of an analogy to our brain. We, of course, have millions and millions of cells, but our brain has, which is kind of the big boss and directs all of our behavior and thought, our brain has some specialized cells that are neurons, and so we're going to talk about that. One thing I want to point out, though, before we move on to getting more in depth, of course, this isn't a neuroscience class, and we aren't going to, unfortunately, because of that, we don't have an opportunity to kind of go into real depth into the brain and understanding in depth about brain systems and brain functioning and all of the brain parts. You're going to have an overview. You're going to understand by the end of this that there are a lot of different parts, and hopefully you'll understand basically how some of the parts of the brain work. But if you're really interested in understanding more about the brain, we do have a really good neuroscience course here at MJC, and in that course, if you take it from Dr. Fichtencourt in a face-to-face course, and I'm not sure what they do online, but that class is offered, and they do brain dissections and really get to understand the workings of the brain on a much deeper level. So I just want to encourage you, if you're interested in that, that is another psychology course that's available to you. So we're talking about the regions of the brain. You guys have on this Canvas page, you have some other videos about the brain. And I want you to take a look at those. The one with the TED Talk about the brain, just watching even the first 5 minutes of that, you get to really look at a fresh brain. You get to see what a brain looks like, learn about all of the, or some of the regions of the brain and how it works. So take a moment. You might want to even pause this video, this lecture, and take a moment to go in and watch that TED Talk so you can get some good information on the work they're doing in studying the brain and all about the brain. So when we're talking about the brain and we're talking about the nervous system, we need to understand that there are some specialized and very significant cells called neurons. And these are really important. You know, later on we'll refer to neurons a little bit when we're talking about child development, for example, because when we talk about brain development, we talk about how the branches of these neurons and how they connect and how that builds gray matter in the brain, and it builds their intelligence and functioning, higher functioning. So it's just pretty amazing. But when we get down to the very cellular level, we can see a difference in development between rats, for example, who have had a very enriched environment. They'll have really dense neuron connections and activity, and those rats that are raised in an environment that does not have a lot of enriching activities like toys and interaction with other rats, they will have much less of, when you look at the down on the cellular level, much less dense quantities of neurons. So here is actually what a neuron kind of looks like at an up close level. It's a cell, and it has these specialized branches that come out from it, and those branches end up connecting with other branches, and they pass information from one thing. They have these electrical impulses, and they pass it through the touch of these dendrites, which are these branchy type, I don't know how to describe it, these little branches that come off of the cell, but those are put out there to connect with other ones, and pretty soon you have these pathways going through the brain where electrical impulses are passed, and that's how the brain functions. I don't need you to know all of the details of this, of the neuron, or you're not gonna, this isn't like in a biology class where you got to know it like really well, but I want you to understand how it works, and because it is really important to understand that how our brain functions, and any interruption in that brain functioning can have an impact, or does have an impact, on our behavior and our thought. And psychologists want to understand what influences our behavior and thinking. And so a neuroscience psychologist, a psychologist who operates under that, on that neuroscience team, is going to study those behaviors on a very detail, like to the cellular level, and understanding what's happening in the brain to explain a certain behavior or thought. So that's why it's important to understand basic functioning of the brain and a neuron. So our nervous system is made up of these cells, these neurons, and they're found in our brain as well as in our central nervous system, which is in our spinal cord here, and that controls also in our central nervous system, as well as this peripheral nervous system, where we have this controls our glands and our internal organs, and it controls the output of our skeletal muscles. So that nervous system is made up of these neurons that have these electrical firings, and it's we consider it an electrochemical network that includes all of the body's neurons. So all of these neurons are found within our central nervous system, in our brain, as well as our spinal cord. And then we have another system in our body called the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is one that is, of course, um, um, run by the brain and run by the nervous system, but the endocrine system is a little bit slower, and it's controlled, a lot of it, by the hypothalamus, which is a brain region that controls that pituitary gland. And in the pituitary gland, we have hormones that then affect other glands. So changes in these, or damage to the pituitary gland or the hypothalamus, can change how our body functions, change mood, change our metabolism, can change our happiness levels, depression levels, anxiety. All of these things are very sensitive. Our body and our emotional functioning are all interconnected. So sometimes when psychologists, want to get medical information on what's happening in a person to understand their behavior and their functioning. So for example, if someone comes to me as a therapist and they say, I just been having some, well, how about this? I've been having a lot of agitation. I don't sleep well at night. My mind is constantly racing. I have, I just am preoccupied. I'm irritable. Okay. As a therapist, I'm going to say, wow, that sounds maybe like some anxiety. It could even be depression. We'd have to learn a little bit more about what's going on. But what I'll ask is, in my assessment process, is, have you been to the doctor? Have you asked your doctor, like, have you had a blood test? Have you had any other checks to make sure and see how you're doing medically? Because those can be really important, because sometimes we have like social emotional issues, and then sometimes we have medical issues that affect these social emotional things. So it's important to understand on a very basic and medical and bodily level how those things can influence our emotions and so on. So we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff more in depth, and I can get off on the tangent very easily when we're talking about that connection between our mind and our body. But these are things that I want you to understand. Also, differences in part of our endocrine system is also our sex organs, which secrete hormones. So we have, of course, in males, we have a greater amount of testosterone, and in females, we have a greater amount of estrogen. And so those different amounts of hormones can make a difference in our functioning and how we interact with people, can have, have influences on our behavior and our thought, which are what psychologists love to look at. So we've got some other videos. I've got some other videos on Canvas about how the brain works, and also about emotions in the brain. Those are really short videos. The narrator has an excellent Australian accent. I think you'll enjoy those, but they give some really good information. I always encourage my students to watch the videos a couple of times. It benefits you to watch the video a couple of times, because the first time you watch it, it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. But the second time you watch it, you get more information. And when these videos are so short, 1 to 2 minutes, it really makes a difference in how much information you can remember, and just how things kind of let them sink in and understand them a little bit better. So let's look at a page from your textbook, which has a diagram of the brain. And I hope you get a chance to really look at this and read about it. In your textbook, you've got a lot of more in-depth information than just this graphic, but we'll talk about a few parts of the brain now that I want you to kind of focus on and just understand maybe its functioning. And again, as you're looking at these, think about how might these be active when you're driving a car. How would it be active? Because that's going to be your assignment, and you need to have maybe some good information from here that you can apply to that. So when you're answering the question, you've got it right. So first part of the brain I want to point out is the amygdala. This is, we can see it right here, kind of central part of the brain. The amygdala has been shown through research to be linked to emotion. A lot of times it's linked to anger and angry outbursts. It's connected with that kind of emotional behavior. And the hippocampus is not too far from it, and it's linked to our memory system. And what's interesting is when we talk about memory later, we're going to go back to this and looking at the brain, but the hippocampus and the amygdala are close to each other and may have some sort of influence on how our memories that have high emotions, if you think about anything with like strong emotions, we have a tendency to remember those more than we do things that weren't tied to a lot of emotion. So there is some relationship with that. So those are a couple different parts of the brain. And how would the amygdala, how might it be connected to think about this, how might it be active when you're driving a car? You know, when we're thinking about emotions, how are those active when we're driving a car? And so, okay, so that's what I want you to think about. Could emotions be, well, if you're upset about something, your amygdala might be you're angry at someone on the road, maybe you have some road rage, maybe you're angry with someone in the car, and it's that's your amygdala functioning because your emotions are functioning while you're driving a car. Simple as that. Let's look at another part of the brain. We have the cerebellum here. We can see it here at the base of the brain, and the cerebellum is the part of the brain that helps with our voluntary movement, our movement that we're choosing to do, like I'm choosing to move my hands right now, that kind of coordination and balance. That part of the brain is impaired when you are under the influence of certain substances, specifically alcohol, and so it can cause you, if you are under the influence of that, your cerebellum is impaired and you're not going to be able to walk straight. Therefore, if you got pulled over and you had one of those tests that the police do for your walking ability, that's because your cerebellum is impaired, that it's not, you're not going to be able to walk. So voluntary movements, coordination and balance, and also helps you remember. I think of like muscle memory, but it also helps you remember certain types of movements and your coordinated movements. So really important part of the brain. Then we have the thalamus. Let's see, here we are. The thalamus is part of the brain that relays messages between the lower parts of the brain and the cerebral cortex. And then the hypothalamus, it helps control your functioning. So it helps control your endocrine system, which again, remember, was that slower functioning. Let's see, I'll look at it, that the slower functioning part of the system that secretes hormones and so on. So it can have an influence on things like eating and your hunger. It's also linked to emotion and responds to rewards, so releases chemicals when you're rewarded, like happy chemicals when you feel rewarded. The reticular formation is right here. We can see this little red band in part of the brain stem here, and that connects to the spinal cord. The reticular formation is something that helps control your arousal levels. When we talk about arousal, we're not necessarily talking about sexual arousal. We're talking about arousal, like how alert and aroused are you? How awake are you? That's your arousal level. And when we talk about arousal, that's what we're referring to, is like, are you awake, or are you dozing off? If someone has damage to their reticular formation, sometimes they can't stay awake. They've done studies, and you've probably read about that, on like cats, where they will remove their or damage their reticular formation and they will never wake up again. So the reticular formation is all about your levels of arousal and alertness. And then let's skip down to the medulla. This part of the brain, again, in kind of the base part of the brain, that primitive brain, that's controlling your basic body functions. So things like your heartbeat and your breathing. I think of people who have brain injuries sometimes, where they stay alive for a period of time and their upper, the frontal lobes are no longer functioning, but this part of the brain, the medulla, which controls the heartbeat and breathing, those kind of very natural responsive parts of our bodily functioning, that's where it, sorry, I got distracted there, but so the medulla then controls those kind of automatic functioning. You don't even have to think about it. Your brain is just making sure your heart's beating and your lungs are functioning, and that's which part of the medulla is the part of the brain that controls that. Of course, there's other parts of the brain. We've also got this corpus callosum. This is a fiber. These are fibers that connect the two parts of the brain. They put them together because you have this right side of the brain, the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. Here I'm pointing you to the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. In order for those two sides of the brain to talk to each other, they have this corpus callosum, which are these fibers that connect the two, and it's responsible for relaying messages to either side of the brain. And as you know, as you've already read, you've got the left side of the brain controlling the right side of the body, and you have the right side of the brain controlling the left side of the body. And so in order to coordinate those two, that corpus callosum helps connect so that information and really that electrochemical communication can happen between the two hemispheres of the brain. Okay, so one last activity to get your mind thinking about this. Which brain region, we've gone over a few, would be, if it were damaged, if this brain region was damaged, which would be most likely to disrupt your ability to skip rope? So skipping rope is something that takes a lot of coordination. So when we looked at the parts of the brain, which part of the brain helped with your coordination and your voluntary movement? I'll give you a second to look at that. If you recall, it's your cerebellum. That's that coordination. So your cerebellum, I just always think of cerebellum and the, what do they call that? The alcohol test that the police do, DUI test, whatever, where they're having you do these coordinated movements and walking, and that's the cerebellum. So that would, if it were damaged, would have the most impact on you if you're jumping rope. Okay, which part of the brain would disrupt your ability to hear and taste? So we talked about, and maybe it's not in here, but we talked about the part of the brain that it has to do with we didn't talk about it, but in your text we did. There's your sensory input. So when we're talking about sensory, we're talking about our senses, and you've learned about your senses when you were in kindergarten, right? Like hearing, seeing, tasting, feeling. Hearing, seeing, taste, feel. What's the other one? You guys know. I'm not able to think of it at the moment, but you understand the different senses. So the part of the brain that kind of relays those messages and controls that is our thalamus. So and that fifth sense was smell. That's what I forgot. You guys were with me. You already knew that. All right, so what part of the brain region could perhaps leave you, if damaged, could leave you in a coma? We did go over this one. Which one was that? Do you remember? If you remember, it is the reticular formation. That was the part of the brain that controls your arousal levels. And so someone in a coma, of course, is not aroused. They're in a coma. They're not responsive. And then finally, what's the brain region that, if it was damaged, could cut off the very breath and heartbeat of life. We talked about this very specifically. If this part of the brain got damaged, you can have no heartbeat or breathing, and that would be the medulla. All right, so that's it. Just a short little lecture to introduce you to the brain. I know you're going to be reading in your textbook about the brain as well, but I hope this is helpful just to kind of review it and point out some important regions that you need to know about.